what it was really like to live in the world of Viking Shieldmaidens. A life far beyond the clichés of roaring warriors, horned helmets, and endless drinking halls. Forget the heroic movie scenes where a fierce woman leaps off a longship, axe in hand, hair whipping in the cold northern wind. The salty sting of the North Sea lashes your face, your breath fogs in the icy air. Behind you, a longhouse still smolders from the night's hearth fire. We'll slip into the quiet crevices of daily life, where a shield maiden kneels to sew a torn tunic with fingers still raw from the haft of her axe. We'll feel the sting of old wounds when she rises at dawn to train again, no matter how her bones protest. We'll hear the soft hush of her voice as she tells her child a bedtime tale, her mind replaying the day's blood and frost. Whether to follow a jarl's order to burn a farm, or to let innocence flee in the dark. Whether to trust your shield wall brother, who might see you as an outsider in the end. Around you, women sharpen blades, mend cloaks, check shields. And you're not just watching. You are one of them. A shield maiden. Too fierce, and they were seen as unnatural witches in disguise. By night, they might stitch wounds in a smoky hall, or whisper ancient runes over cuts that would not close. The shield maiden's world was a shifting web of violence and tenderness, loyalty and betrayal, love and endless frost. Too gentle, and they risked losing respect, their weapons seen as mere decoration rather than tools of war. This is what it was really like to live in the world of a Viking shield maiden, beyond the saga songs, beyond the battlefield, beyond the shadows. Her breath turning silver in the air, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a hunger for something beyond. Beyond honor, beyond the next battle, a longing for a future that perhaps did not exist for her. Tonight, we're diving into the real rhythms of life, the frostbitten mornings, the silent prayers before raids, the tiny joys hidden inside raw survival, and the whispered fears under the moonlight. But what did it truly mean? Beyond the songs and sagas, what did it cost to carry a sword as a woman in a society built on strength, honor, and unrelenting winter? We'll follow her out into the frost, into the roar of battle, into the silent corners of her mind. Imagine the scent of burning pitch, the creak of leather straps against your shoulders, the cold metal weight resting at your side, and who paid for it in blood, bone, and the quietest corners of her soul. Let me guide you across frozen fjords, through silent forests, into the candle-lit longhouses and bloody fields of the Viking world. We'll see what it was really like to live in her boots, to feel her pulse, to watch her shape her fate, one swing at a time. But they skipped the nights spent scrubbing the iron smell of blood off her skin, the quiet envy when she watches village girls live simpler, safer lives, the loneliness that settles deep like snow inside her ribs. Others were pushed into the role, daughters of chieftains who had no sons, sisters left behind to guard when the men were gone. Whatever the reason, each day they carried a weight heavier than any sword. Hey there, friend. Imagine this. You're standing on a rocky shore at dawn. It sounds romantic, to fight beside men, to stand as an equal in battle. In this story, we won't only follow the clang of weapons or the thunderous cheers after a raid. The sagas love to show us the grand victories, the moment when a woman stands atop a fallen enemy, hair wild, eyes blazing. Some shield maidens chose this path willingly, drawn to the promise of freedom, to the rare chance of forging their own story, rather than becoming a wife traded for cattle and silver. Life as a shield maiden was not just about glory. It was about the 1,000 invisible choices that no bard ever sang. Whether to raid a nearby village for winter stores or barter in secret, even among their own, these women walked a thin, icy line. By day, they might fight beside brothers in arms, rowing the longship's oar as calluses bled under the salt spray. And in the dark hours before a raid, when the sky glowed with northern lights, she might step outside alone tonight. We won't rush past these moments. So if you're ready, wrap yourself in your thickest cloak. This isn't just a story of a warrior. It's the story of a woman who chose to carve her own legend, or was forced to become one. Welcome to the true world behind the legends. Before she could wield an axe or stare into the eyes of a dying enemy without flinching, she was just a girl, a daughter of the North, born under skies the color of steel. Her first lullabies were not gentle songs, but the crash of waves on the fjord, and the low chant of her father reciting sagas by the hearth. She learned early that warmth was rare and fleeting. The longhouse was always smoky, thick with the smell of seal fat lamps and boiling fish. In winter, she could see her own breath rising like a spirit as she pressed her fingers into wool scraps to keep them from going numb. From her mother, she learned to weave, to mend, to make cheese and preserve fish. From her father, she learned silence, that heavy, unspoken language of a warrior returning home with blood on his tunic and eyes looking beyond the horizon. Some nights, she crept to the door when she heard the men return from raids. She watched them stagger inside, faces flushed with drink, arms dragging stolen shields and sacks heavy with silver. Her mother's eyes would flick to her, sharp as a hawk's, silently warning, "Go back to bed." But she didn't always listen. She saw how the men laughed, their hair tangled, their mouths stained with mead. She saw her father's blade, notched and sticky, laid across the table like a sleeping snake. And though her mother said these stories were not for a girl's ears, she drank every word. At night, alone on her straw mat, she whispered to the gods, to Odin the All-Father, to Freya of the battle-slain, to Thor of the Stormhammer. She didn't pray for a good husband or fertile fields. She prayed for courage, for strength, for a day when she might hold that notched blade in her own hands. It started small. A wooden stick, stolen from the hearth, swung clumsily in the shadows outside the longhouse. Her brothers sneered at first, but when they saw her bruised knuckles and the splinters embedded in her skin, they stopped laughing. One day, her older brother tried to wrestle her to the ground in jest. She twisted free and slammed her forearm into his throat, dropping him to his knees in a choked gasp. Their father saw. He didn't scold her. Instead, he called her over, pressed his rough hand against her shoulder, and for the first time, he smiled. Soon after, she was given her first real blade, small, heavy, and ugly as a winter crow. She practiced in secret, feeling the cold iron sing in her grip, feeling the ache bloom in her forearms. Every morning, before the sun touched the fjord, she was already moving, mimicking the warrior she watched in the yard. Her breath turned to mist, her body stiff as birch in the frost, but she refused to stop. Her mother noticed the bruises, the broken nails, the cuts hidden beneath the sleeves of her tunic. Each night, they shared a silence thicker than whale oil. One evening, as they prepared dried fish over the hearth, her mother finally spoke. "Why do you chase the path of men? You think the gods favor you for your stubbornness? You think a sword will keep you warm when you have no family left to tend the hearth?" She didn't answer. The question sat heavy between them, like a stone on her chest. That winter, a fever swept through the village. Her youngest brother died first, small, quiet, barely old enough to speak. Then 2 neighbors fell. The air tasted of smoke and sweat and grief. Every morning, she watched the longhouse door, waiting to see which family would carry out another small, wrapped body. In these days, she learned something deeper than swordplay, the cost of life, the cruel rhythm of breath and silence. When spring finally came, she was different. Her face had thinned, her eyes sunken but bright as wolf's eyes in the dark. She no longer played with the village girls or laughed at the marketplace. She sharpened her blade until it sang under her fingers. The elders whispered about her. Some said she was touched by Freya, blessed with a warrior spirit. Others thought her cursed, that she would bring misfortune to any man who took her hand. The truth was simpler. She didn't want to wait for a man to shape her story. She would carve her own. As the years passed, raiding parties began to accept her presence on the training fields. At first, they gave her blunt blades, laughed when she stumbled. But each bruise became a lesson. Each cut a line of poetry etched into her skin. The first time she broke a man's nose, the laughter stopped. One morning, the Jarl himself watched her spar. He stood silently, his fur cloak flapping in the sea wind, eyes like stone. She felt his gaze as she moved, the swing, the pivot, the strike. When she finished, breath ragged and hair stuck to her face with sweat, he called her over. "Do you bleed?" he asked, voice like gravel. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Then you're no different from the rest of us," he said, tossing her a battered wooden shield. "Prove it." From that day, she carried a shield as well as her blade. She learned the rhythm of the shield wall, the push, the lock of knees and hips, the moment of stillness before the clash. She felt the weight of responsibility, not just for her own life, but for the lives of those beside her. At night, in the longhouse, she still stitched tunics and mended nets, hands trembling from the day's drills. Some nights, she dreamt of distant shores, of sailing into the unknown, of standing in the prow of a longship as the waves crashed over her. Other nights, she dreamt of warmth, of a hearth, a simple life she would never know. Her mother aged quickly, lines deepening like cracks in ice. They spoke little, but sometimes, in the flicker of firelight, her mother's eyes softened, and the girl, who once was a daughter, peeked through the cracks. In these moments, they shared a silent understanding. Love does not always speak, and sometimes it stands in the doorway, watching you walk away into the dark. By the time she reached her 20th winter, she had earned her place among the raiders. She was no longer the girl. She was the Shieldmaiden, the one who fought like a cornered wolf, who moved with a grace that seemed unnatural, who laughed in the face of an axe swing. The village children whispered about her. They said she could talk to ravens, that she bathed in the blood of enemies to keep her spirit strong. She never corrected them. Sometimes it was better to let legends grow. But behind the hardened face, there were nights when she pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the flutter of her heart like a trapped bird. Nights when she wondered if her father would have been proud, if her mother's silent stares were curses or prayers. On the eve of her first true raid, she knelt by the fjord, the moon slicing the black water into silver shards. She whispered to the gods again, not for victory, not for glory, for a place to belong, she breathed, for the strength to stand alone. As she rose, the frost bit at her legs, the air sharp and alive. She turned toward the village, her silhouette a dark blade against the pale dawn. Tomorrow, she would sail. Tomorrow, she would step fully into the world she had chosen. When the sun rose, the village buzzed with an electric anticipation only known to those on the edge of departure. You could taste the salt in the air, the iron tang of sharpened weapons, the quiet tremor of hearts preparing to leap into chaos. The longships stood ready at the shore, their dragon-headed prows slicing the mist like silent watchers of fate. The wooden hulls were slick with morning dew, each plank etched with runes and charms for protection, prosperity, and vengeance. She stood among the men now, her braids tight against her scalp, a thin layer of seal oil rubbed into her skin to stave off the cold sea wind. Each warrior checked and rechecked his gear, axe edges, leather straps, woolen cloaks. Among them she moved like a shadow, her eyes catching on each detail, the tremble in a young boy's fingers as he adjusted his belt, the nervous twitch in a seasoned raider's jaw as he scanned the gray horizon. They all pretended not to see her, but they saw. And in the quietest corners of their minds, they wondered what curse or blessing had brought this woman among them. A young man, barely older than a summer lamb, approached her, trying to mask the terror twisting his features. His lips opened, but no sound came at first. She met his gaze, steady, unwavering, until his words finally tumbled out. "Do you ... are you afraid?" he asked, voice raw and thin. She paused, turning her blade in her hands, feeling the cool weight against her palm. "Fear is a gift," she replied softly. "It keeps your feet on the earth, your eyes wide. Use it. When it leaves you, that is when you die." His eyes widened, as if she'd spoken a secret no one had dared say aloud. She left him with that thought, stepping forward to the water's edge. She knelt, dipping her fingers into the fjord. The water stung, sharp as a blade against her skin. With a small motion, she touched her fingers to her forehead, then to her lips, a quiet invocation to Ran, the sea goddess, to carry her ship and not claim her body too soon. Nearby, the Jarl oversaw final preparations. His presence was like a mountain at dawn, solid, immovable, ancient. His armor glinted dully in the morning fog, fur cloak heaving with each breath. When his eyes found hers, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that she was no longer merely tolerated. She was needed. A horn sounded, deep and mournful, echoing off the water and into the spine of every soul gathered there. It was the call to board, the final heartbeat before the leap into the abyss. She climbed aboard, stepping between barrels of dried fish, coils of rope, sacks of grain. Every movement felt deliberate, sacred. She took her place near the prow, hands steady on her shield, eyes already scanning the mists ahead as if she might see the battles before they began. The longship pushed off, gliding away from the land she had known all her life. The rhythmic chant of the rowers began, deep and primal, a living heartbeat of oak and muscle. She felt the vibration through the soles of her boots, into her bones. The sea opened before them, an endless gray mirror reflecting every fear and dream hidden in each warrior's chest. Seagulls screamed overhead, circling like white ghosts, their cries lost in the beat of the oars. Hours passed. The shore shrank into a smudge of brown and green, and disappeared entirely behind curtains of mist. She closed her eyes, letting the salt air carve lines into her face, letting her mind wander back to the first time she understood the ocean's true power. She had been 10. Her father took her to the edge of the cliffs, where the sea roared below like an endless, hungry wolf. He said nothing, simply stood beside her as the wind battered their hair and the spray leapt high into the sky. "Everything worth having," he finally said, his voice barely louder than the wind, "lies beyond fear." Those words had gnawed at her for years, echoing in her mind every time she tasted pain or loss. They had become the silent drumbeat beneath every swing of her blade, every locked shield, every breath drawn in the shadow of death. A sudden gust caught her attention, snapping her back to the present. Ahead, the Jarl stood, hand raised, signaling for silence. The rowers slowed, the chanting ceased, leaving only the soft slap of waves against the hull. She moved forward, peering into the fog. The shape of another ship emerged slowly, their allies, perhaps, or their doom. The tension was thick enough to slice with her cheeks. Her fingers tightened on the hilt, her heartbeat quickening into a war rhythm. A cry rang out from the lookout. "Land!" The tension broke like a snapped bowstring. Cheers erupted, laughter tinged with relief and adrenaline. The men began to ready their arms, adjusting helms, tightening bracers. She did not cheer. Her eyes were fixed on the dark smudge of coastline growing larger by the heartbeat. She remembered the stories, the first step on foreign soil, the scent of burning thatch, the cries of the conquered, the split second when life and death balanced on a blade's edge. She whispered once more to the gods, but now it was not a prayer for courage. It was a promise, to stand firm, to fight until her blood watered the earth, to become more than a legend whispered by children in smoky halls. Beside her, The young man from earlier fumbled with his helmet strap. She reached over, fastened it with swift, practiced fingers. Their eyes met briefly, his full of panic, hers burning like coals. "You'll live," she told him, "or you'll die well. Either way, don't shame your ancestors." He swallowed hard and nodded. The longship scraped against the pebbled shore, the sound like the gnash of a giant's teeth. Warriors leapt over the sides into knee-deep water, shields up, axes gleaming. She followed, the cold instantly numbing her legs, the shock coursing up her spine like lightning. She moved with the shield wall, each step forward echoing with centuries of ancestors behind her. As they advanced, she felt her pulse slow, her breathing deepen, as if she were not approaching slaughter, but stepping into her true skin. A stone flew past her ear, thudding into a man behind her. He fell without a sound. Blood sprayed, painting the rocks in arcs of red. She did not flinch. She surged forward, locking her shield with those on either side, the formation now a solid breathing creature of wood and flesh and rage. A first clash came fast. A rush of figures from the settlement, wielding pitchforks and knives, desperation in their eyes. She met them head-on, her blade darting past her shield like a serpent's fang. One man's scream ended abruptly as her steel found his neck. Another fell as she slammed her shield's edge into his temple. Time fractured into flashes, a foot slipping on blood-slick rocks, the smell of burning hair, a sudden burst of warmth across her cheek that she realized was her own blood. But she kept moving, kept striking, each kill a silent verse in a poem only she could hear. Through the chaos, she saw the young man again. He fought clumsily, fear writ large on his face, but he was still standing. She pivoted toward him, catching an attacker's downward swing meant for his head. With a single motion, she reversed her blade, driving it into the man's belly. The young man gasped, eyes wide. She only nodded once, then turned back to the fray. As the sun began its slow descent, the settlement burned behind them, the air thick with the stench of smoke and iron. She stood at the edge of the village, shoulders heaving, every muscle singing with exhaustion and triumph. This was her first true raid, her first true baptism. The stories had been half-truths softened for the hearth. The real song was harsher, darker, but somehow more beautiful. She pressed her blade into the ground, leaning heavily. For a moment, she felt an echo, as if the earth itself hummed beneath her, welcoming her into its eternal memory. When she finally lifted her head, the last rays of the sun bathed her in a bloody light. She was no longer just the Shieldmaiden of whispers. She was alive, and she had claimed her place among the gods and the dead. The smoke curled into the twilight sky, twisting like black serpents into the fading sun. Ash drifted across her arms and settled into her hair, tangling with the salt from the sea, and the blood splattered across her face. She stood at the village edge, a silent statue among the chaos. Around her, warriors dragged loot toward the longships, bolts of cloth, carved bowls, sacks of grain, and terrified villagers bound and stumbling. Some raiders whooped and sang old victory chants, their voices cracking from exhaustion and mead already stolen from burning halls. Others sat on the rocks, faces slack, staring at their blood-slicked hands as if waking from a trance. She watched them without moving. Her hands still gripped her shield and blade, her knuckles white as frost. The adrenaline had not yet drained. It clung to her ribs like a second heartbeat, echoing, echoing. A small sound broke her reverie, a whimper behind a half-burned hut. She turned sharply, every muscle coiled. Creeping forward, she found a woman huddled in the shadows, clutching a child to her chest. The woman's eyes were wide and glassy, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The child's hair was matted with soot, a single braid falling limp down her back. They looked up at her, trembling. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the distant crackle of fire, and the rhythmic clank of metal as warriors gathered spoils. Her blade hung at her side, heavy and expectant. She felt its weight, the countless decisions it demanded, the finality of its song. The woman squeezed her child tighter, her shoulders shaking as she waited for the strike. But the blade did not rise. Instead, the Shieldmaiden knelt slowly until her gaze was level with the girl's wide, tear-glazed eyes. "Run," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like wind scraping across ice. The woman froze, disbelieving. "Now," she repeated, her eyes flicking toward the distant rocks where the ships waited, where the raiders were too distracted to notice two shadows slip away. The woman lurched forward, pulling the girl with her. For a moment, the girl hesitated, glancing back at the Shieldmaiden as if trying to memorize her face. Then they disappeared into the night, swallowed by darkness. She stayed kneeling, her fingers gripping the dirt. Her breath came in sharp, uneven pulls, the taste of iron thick on her tongue. She pressed her forehead to the ground, the warmth of the earth bleeding into her skull, grounding her. When she finally stood, she felt both lighter and infinitely heavier. She returned to the main clearing, where the Jarl stood surrounded by his lieutenants. His eyes were bright, alive with the fever of victory. He turned when he saw her, a slow grin spreading beneath his thick beard. "You have blood on your face," he said, almost laughing. She wiped her cheek absently, leaving a dark smear across her jaw. "Your first true raid," he continued, stepping forward and clapping a massive hand on her shoulder. "How does it feel to be born again?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat felt raw, scraped clean by screams she had not made. The Jarl did not seem to mind. He threw his head back and let out a bellowing laugh, turning to the others. "This one fights like the daughter of Thor himself." He roared, and a chorus of drumming cheers followed. Some slapped her back, others raised horns of mead in her honor. But in each set of eyes she met, she saw the same flicker of something deeper. Fear, awe, perhaps even a question they dared not voice. What did she see out there beyond the steel? That night, they feasted on stolen sheep and smoked fish, drinking deeply from looted barrels. Someone played a lyre with broken strings. Another danced a stumbling, half-forgotten war dance. The fires burned high, crackling loud enough to mask the quiet moans of wounded men and the whimpers of captives tied near the shore. She sat apart from the main circle, her shield resting against her leg. Every now and then, she turned it in her hands, tracing the deep cuts and new scars on its surface. The young man she had saved earlier approached her, his steps hesitant. He carried a small wooden cup of mead, offering it to her with both hands. "Drink," he said, voice trembling but earnest. She looked at him, then at the cup, and finally accepted it. The mead burned down her throat, filling her with a brief warmth that flickered and died almost as quickly as it came. He knelt beside her, eyes darting to the blood drying on her fingers. "You saved me," he blurted suddenly, as if the words had been choking him since sunset. She did not reply immediately. She tilted her head, studying him in the firelight. "You fought," she said finally. "That is enough." He swallowed, staring into the flames. Silence stretched between them, heavy as an anchor. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "I thought I would die. My hands would not stop shaking. I saw my mother's face in every swing. But when you came, it was like the sagas, like Freya's shield shining above me." Her lips twitched, the ghost of a smile, or perhaps a grimace. "Stories are kinder than the sea," she said, almost to herself. He opened his mouth to answer, but she had already turned away, her eyes distant, fixed on the waves beyond the fire's reach. In the darkness, the ocean whispered secrets only she seemed to hear. The crash of waves against the hulls, the hush of the tide retreating over pebbles. It sounded like a mother's lullaby and a funeral dirge all at once. That night, As the others drifted into drunken sleep, she remained awake. Her fingers absent-mindedly polished her blade, even as her mind drifted elsewhere. She thought of her mother's silent eyes, of her father's words on the cliff, of the girl she let go. She rose before dawn, moving to the edge of the shore. She knelt again, pressing her forehead to the cold sand, letting the water lap at her knees. "For all the blood," she whispered, voice hoarse, "for all the ghosts I now carry." The horizon slowly brightened, a thin line of fire against the endless gray. She stood, lifting her blade to the sky, watching as the first rays caught on the edge of steel. Behind her, the camp began to stir. She heard the groans of the waking warriors, the coughs and curses as they prepared to sail again. She turned back to them, face calm, every muscle taut with quiet resolve. She knew now that there was no turning back, that each raid would peel another layer of her away, leaving something raw and hungry beneath. But she had chosen this path, and no god, no man, no ghost of a mother's sorrow could turn her from it. Tomorrow, they would sail again. Tomorrow, more blood would flow. Tomorrow, she would step deeper into the story she was writing on her own flesh, line by line. And when the songs were sung, when the halls echoed with her name, they would never know the truth she carried beneath the braids and steel, that her greatest battles were not against foreign warriors or angry gods, but within the quiet dark of her own soul. The next morning, the camp was a restless hive. Warriors moved between piles of loot, checking axes, repacking ropes, mending sails. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp as spear tips, while smoke from last night's fires drifted low over the black sand. She stood at the water's edge again, her toes sinking into wet sand, eyes fixed on the pale streak of the rising sun. Her breath came slow and controlled, her shoulders steady despite the cold. A young boy, no more than 12, stumbled toward her carrying a bundle of arrows strapped together with rough twine. His cheeks were smudged with ash, and his eyes darted nervously each time an older warrior barked an order. He stopped when he saw her, his thin chest heaving. In his small, dirty hands, he held out one arrow, its shaft newly fletched. "For you," he stammered. I made it. I wanted for you to take it." She looked at the arrow, then at him. His hair stuck up in uneven tufts, and a half-healed scar ran from his brow to his ear, a reminder of some earlier lesson, some earlier violence. Without a word, she took the arrow and examined it. The fletching was clumsy, feathers uneven, the binding rough. But it would fly true enough in the right hands. She nodded once, a single sharp dip of her chin. The boy's eyes lit up like a fire catching dry moss, and he turned and sprinted back toward the other boys, who watched from a distance. In that moment, she felt the unexpected sting of something deep and old, the small warmth of connection, so fleeting it almost hurt more than any blade. Behind her, the Jarl's booming voice cut through the morning air. He stood atop a pile of shields, shouting orders, listing names, counting spoils. He barked at a warrior who had come back empty-handed, and at a woman who had taken a goat rather than gold. The Shieldmaiden turned from the water and moved toward her companions, slipping into the controlled chaos with practiced ease. Each warrior she passed looked at her differently now, no longer the girl with quiet eyes, but a figure marked by blood, the glint of the sea, and that unspoken promise of violence. She checked her armor, sliding her fingers along the leather seams, testing the iron rings for weakness. Her shield bore new notches, reminders of close calls and hidden blades. She ran her thumb across each one, each groove like a verse in her personal saga. Nearby, two warriors argued over a helm. One claimed it by conquest, the other by right of rank. Their voices rose, hands moving to hilts. Before either could strike, she stepped between them, her presence sudden and undeniable. They froze. Her gaze flicked between them, calm but sharp enough to slice through their drunken rage. "Is this worth dying for?" she asked, voice low, even. They shifted, eyes dropping. The larger one let go first, muttering curses under his breath. The other followed, tossing the helm to the ground and stalking away. She bent, picked up the helm, and placed it atop a crate. "Decide tonight," she said to no one in particular. "After the blood has cooled." Her words spread like a ripple. A few warriors nearby nodded. One older man clapped her shoulder as she passed, a ghost of respect in his touch. She continued toward the longship, stopping to inspect the cargo: heavy chests of silver, iron tools, carved statues stolen from distant altars. There were also barrels of dried fish and mead, bundles of woven cloth, tokens not just of greed but survival. As she worked, a sudden sharp cry split the air. She turned instantly, eyes narrowing. Near the edge of the camp, a group of warriors surrounded a young woman, her dress torn, hair tangled, eyes wild with terror. They jeered, pushing her between them like a game piece. Her hands scrabbled at the ground, her knees raw and bleeding. Before she realized she was moving, the Shieldmaiden's feet pounded the earth. She shoved the first man aside with her shield, a crack of bone loud and final. Another swung at her, but she pivoted, smashing her hilt into his jaw. The circle fell apart in an instant. The woman on the ground sobbed, curling into herself. The Shieldmaiden knelt, resting a hand on the woman's shoulder. Her touch was firm, steady, the same steadiness that had guided her blade the night before. "Up," she murmured. "You are not prey." Slowly, painfully, the woman rose. The Shieldmaiden stepped between her and the warriors, her sword now drawn and gleaming in the morning light. The men hesitated. Blood trickled from the broken nose of the first. Another spat out a tooth, rage twisting his features. "You shame us," she said evenly, her voice carrying in the still air. "We take what we must to survive, but we do not break what we take." One man took a step forward, weapon half raised. She did not flinch. In the distance, the Jarl approached, eyes locked on the confrontation. He looked from the woman to the men, then to the Shieldmaiden. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The waves still whispered against the sand. The gulls still cried overhead. But every breath, every heartbeat belonged to this moment. Finally, the Jarl spat into the dirt. "Enough," he barked, his voice sharp as a thrown axe. "Go!" The warriors scattered, casting furtive glances back. The Shieldmaiden sheathed her sword, her gaze still locked on their retreating forms. When she turned back to the woman, she found her trembling but standing. "Find a cloak," she said. "Stay close to the shore until we leave." The woman nodded, eyes wide and shining with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. As the Shieldmaiden watched her slip away, she felt the familiar weight return, the weight of choices, the silent tally of debts and oaths no one else would ever see. She turned toward the Jarl, who now studied her with a new, unreadable expression. "You interfere," he said, voice low. "I lead," she corrected, her tone steady. The Jarl barked a laugh, his teeth flashing. "Perhaps you do," he said, turning away. "Perhaps you do." When she returned to her preparations, the warriors watched her differently again, some with respect, some with fear, some with both. She tightened the leather straps on her wrist guards, slid her hand across the edge of her blade, and breathed deeply. Tonight, they would set sail for another coast, another raid, another test of the blade and the spirit. But in the quiet space between battle cries and night fires, she felt the cracks forming beneath her skin, fine fractures spreading, whispering of the ghosts she gathered, the lines she crossed, the faces she would never forget. And yet, she stepped forward all the same, because this was the life she had chosen. A life written in salt and blood, in steel and silence. A life as a Shieldmaiden. The wind that morning was different. Not a soft caress, but a sharp, insistent shove. The longship rocked gently at first, then began to tug at its moorings like a wolf straining at its leash. Warriors moved about the deck with urgent precision, their breath puffing white in the cold air, voices rising in clipped commands that sounded like barks from a distant battlefield. She stood at the prow, fingers curled around the dragon-headed figurehead. The carved wood was smooth from years of salt spray and sun, but she could still feel the grooves beneath her palms, scars of old battle's repairs, hastily made between raids, the imprint of the countless hands that had held on during storms. Below her feet, the deck vibrated with life. Boots thudding, shields clanking, ropes snaking across planks like restless serpents. Young thralls scurried about carrying water barrels and sacks of dried fish, their thin arms trembling under the weight. The oarsmen settled into their benches, flexing calloused fingers, some muttering prayers to Njord, god of the sea, or to Ran, the goddess who dragged sailors into the deep. She drew a slow breath, tasting the salt and the promise of violence that seemed to hang in the morning mist. This was no ceremonial voyage, no gentle trading expedition. The whispers last night had spread like wildfire. A wealthy monastery stood unguarded, its golden relics gleaming in candlelit halls, its walls built more for prayer than for defense. She had felt it in her bones before anyone spoke. Tonight, blood would run in rivulets down the marble steps, echoing the pulse in her own veins. At the stern, the Jarl roared orders, his voice cutting above the creak of wood and the slap of water. His cloak billowed like a dark wave, and at his side hung a sword so nicked and weathered it looked older than the ship itself. A horn blast split the air, one long rising call that turned every head. The warriors fell silent. She felt the hush spread through her chest, coiling around her heart like a serpent. Then, without warning, a second blast. The oars dipped in unison. The ship groaned forward, slicing through the shallow inlet and out toward the waiting sea. She stayed at the prow, hair whipping across her face, eyes narrowed against the salt spray. Each heave of the oars felt like a drumbeat beneath her ribs, pulling her deeper into a trance she both feared and craved. One by one, the coastline receded. The black sand beach, the bonfires now reduced to smoldering dots, the figures of the women and children left behind, growing smaller until they blurred into the horizon. As the land vanished, the ship seemed to breathe. The warriors shifted from tense readiness to that restless anticipation known only to those who lived on the edge of violence. A few began to sing low chants, old songs of dragons and ancestors, of mead halls and slain giants, verses meant to call courage into weary bones. She closed her eyes and listened. The chanting rose, layered and hypnotic. A younger warrior near her side tapped his axe half to the rhythm, eyes shining with the fever of battle yet to come. In the spaces between the chants, she heard other sounds, the creak of leather armor, the sharp intake of breath before a yell, the scrape of bone amulets against iron. These were the sounds of a tribe in motion, a floating hive of fury and hunger. Hours passed in this rhythm. Waves slapped the hull, sometimes gently, sometimes with a force that made the planks shudder. Sea spray left a crust of salt on her lips, and her fingers cramped from holding the figurehead too tightly. But she did not let go. A seagull passed overhead, trailing a mournful cry that vanished into the wind. She watched it, imagining for a heartbeat what it would be like to be free from weight and blade, from duty and legend, to simply fly over the sea and disappear beyond the clouds. Then, as if on cue, the horizon shifted. The lookout atop the mast shouted, his voice nearly lost to the wind. Land. Warriors stirred, necks craning, hands tightening on spear shafts and sword hilts. A ripple of energy surged through the ship, an invisible lightning bolt that stiffened spines and widened eyes. She squinted toward the distant smudge of green and brown, the outline of a headland rising slowly from the waves. The Jarl stomped to the prow, his heavy boots echoing against the deck. He stood beside her, his breath ragged from exertion or excitement. She could not tell. "See it?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the dark shape. "I see it," she replied without turning. He laughed, the sound like a war drum. "Tonight," he said, his voice low but thick with hunger, "the monks will hear the thunder of Thor before they hear our steps." She did not answer. Instead, she studied the coastline, tracing potential landing spots, calculating tides and currents in her mind. Every ridge, every bend could mean life or death, victory or oblivion. As the ship closed the distance, the sea grew choppier, waves smacking the hull at odd angles. Warriors leaned into each stroke, faces twisted in grimaces of effort. The chanting stopped, replaced by labored breathing and the occasional barked command. At last, the keel scraped sand. Warriors leapt overboard, water surging up to their waists as they dragged the ship higher onto the shore. The Jarl roared, sword held aloft, and the warriors answered with a deafening howl. She stepped into the surf last, her boots sinking into the wet sand. The cold bit her skin instantly, but she welcomed it. It grounded her, drew her mind away from the distant ghosts waiting in the monastery walls. She slung her shield over her back, checked her sword again. Nearby, two warriors argued over which path to take inland. She ignored them, instead scanning the tree line, searching for movement, a monk fleeing in terror, a scout spotting their approach. Anything, nothing. Only the hush of pine needles in the breeze, and the distant crash of waves against hidden cliffs. When the Jarl gave the signal, they moved forward, a line of dark figures slipping between tree trunks like wolves at dusk. Her mind ran ahead of her feet, already inside the monastery, already counting the seconds it would take to breach the main gate, imagining the smell of wax and incense mixing with blood and fear. In that moment, she felt herself split in two. One half remained on the forest floor, boots crushing moss, eyes sharp for traps or alarms. The other half hovered above, watching as if from some unseen perch, cold and analytical. This was the part no one spoke of when they whispered of shield maidens around fires. The second self that lived in the fog of war, the part that judged every movement with inhuman detachment. Some called it madness. Others, a gift from the gods. She did not name it at all. Ahead, the first spire appeared between the trees. She drew a sharp breath. The monastery rose like a ghost, its white walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. This was it. She touched the boy's arrow, still tucked at her side, a charm against hesitation, a thread tying her back to something small, human. She exhaled, gripped her sword, and stepped forward. They crept forward like a living tide, each warrior spaced at arm's length, shields hugging their backs, blades drawn but held low to avoid the moonlight's treacherous gleam. The pine trees gave way to an open clearing, where a stone path led directly to the monastery gates. She paused at the tree line, studying the structure. Its walls were high but narrow, clearly built for devotion, not defense. At the top, a small bell tower rose, its iron bell motionless in the night breeze. A dog barked somewhere beyond the wall. Then another joined in closer. The warriors froze, every breath held hostage. She felt the familiar tightness coil in her stomach, the shared tension before the first scream, before the first crimson bloom of blood against pale robes. A monk appeared on the wall, holding a lantern. Its faint glow illuminated his pale, shaven face and the thin line of his lips. For a brief moment, she imagined he looked almost serene, a ghost drifting above the mortal world. Then his eyes fell on them. He opened his mouth to shout, but before sound escaped, an arrow hissed from the trees and struck his throat. His hands flew up, the lantern crashing to the stones below, snuffing out in a brief sputter of sparks. He crumpled silently. A ripple went through the warriors. The Jarl's voice, low and sharp as an axe edge, cut the hush. Forward. They burst from the trees, boots thudding over the stone path. A few warriors leapt ahead to smash the small gate, their axes rising and falling in bright arcs. Wood splintered, hinges screamed. Inside the walls, confusion exploded like a struck hive. Monks ran in all directions, some clutching books, others brandishing wooden crosses as if they might shield them from steel. Bells began to toll in frantic waves, echoing across the compound and out toward the sea. She vaulted over a fallen monk, sword sweeping low to deflect a wild swing from another who had picked up a broken staff. Blood spattered her cheek, warm and oddly comforting, like the rush of a hot spring in winter. Near the chapel entrance, she saw a group of monks dragging a large ornate chest toward a hidden door. One stumbled, spilling a cascade of golden chalices and silver plates. She charged forward, bashing her shield into one man's ribs. He fell, wheezing, eyes wide with terror. Another monk turned to flee, but she caught his robe and yanked him backward, the cloth tearing in her grip. With a single strike, she dropped him to the ground. The chest lay half open, its contents gleaming under the torchlight. Relics, jewelry, coins, a lifetime of devotion hoarded behind stone walls. She hesitated, her eyes roving over the gleam. This was not merely plunder. These were objects soaked in prayers, in whispered hopes, in centuries of unspoken fears. She felt a flicker of unease in her chest, the boy's arrow at her side, an echo of a different life. Then she slammed the chest shut and signaled 2 warriors to carry it. This was survival, she reminded herself. This was the future secured by blood and fire. Beyond the chapel, she heard the Jarl's roar, followed by a chorus of shouts as more monks fell or fled into the night. The air filled with the thick scent of burning incense, sharp as metal on the tongue. She pushed deeper into the compound, moving from hall to hall. In the scriptorium, she found scrolls stacked in neat rows, delicate pages covered in twisting letters and painted figures of saints. A young monk huddled in the corner, clutching a manuscript to his chest, as though it might shield his heart. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither moved. In that frozen heartbeat, she saw him not as prey, but as a mirror, a creature clinging desperately to meaning amid chaos. She raised her sword, but his trembling hand slid the manuscript forward, offering it to her instead. She lowered her blade. The manuscript lay between them like a fragile heartbeat. She did not take it. Instead, she turned and left him there, sinking into sobs as he pressed the manuscript to his forehead. Outside, flames now licked the roof beams. Warriors dragged crates and sacks toward the gate, their laughter rising above the crackling fire. One man danced with a golden chalice in each hand, mead sloshing over the rims. She rejoined the main group, her face a mask of calm. "Move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the drunken glee. "Load the ship." The warriors obeyed, sobered by the steel in her tone. Even the Jarl glanced at her, his expression flickering between irritation and respect. In the chaos, she spotted a woman, a nun, her hair shorn, her hands clasped in prayer, even as tears streaked her soot-darkened face. Their eyes locked. The nun did not run. She did not scream. She simply watched, lips moving silently in a final, private plea. The Shieldmaiden stepped forward, but stopped a few paces away. The nun opened her hands, revealing a small carved figure of a saint, worn smooth by countless fingers. She extended it toward the Shieldmaiden. For a moment, the world shrank to just them. 2 women standing amid ruin, each carrying her own form of faith. The Shieldmaiden stepped forward, took the carving gently. It was warm from the nun's touch. No words passed between them. Only a thin thread of understanding, so fragile it could have been severed by a single breath. She nodded once, turned, and strode back toward the gate. As the warriors streamed out, she climbed onto a crate and scanned the burning compound. Her gaze swept over fallen monks, smashed altars, scattered scrolls. Victory had been claimed, but at what cost? A young warrior stopped beside her, his helmet missing, a thin cut across his brow, still weeping blood. "We won," he panted, eyes alight with savage joy. "We have enough gold to fill 3 holds." She looked down at him, her face unreadable. "We won a night," she corrected. "Tomorrow, the sea will remind us of our smallness." The young man faltered, his grin fading. She stepped down, the carved figure still in her palm, and moved toward the shore. Each step felt heavy, as though the earth pulled at her ankles, demanding a tally of every ghost she carried. The longship loomed ahead, its dragon head silhouetted against the night sky, now lit by the burning monastery behind them. Warriors tossed crates aboard, lashed barrels to the deck, shouted jokes that died quickly in the rising wind. She climbed aboard last, pausing at the figurehead. Slowly, almost reverently, she slipped the small carved saint into a hidden niche between planks, a silent offering to the sea, or perhaps to something even older than the gods she knew. The Jarl clapped her shoulder as she passed him, his grin wide. "Strong raid," he said. "The gods favor us." She met his eyes. "Tonight," she said, her voice low. "Tomorrow, they may not remember us at all." The Jarl's laughter trailed after her as she moved to her place near the prow. The oars dipped into the black water, and the ship eased away from shore. Flames rose behind them, reflected in the waves like shattered stars. The wind shifted, tugging at her braids, stinging her eyes. She closed them, letting the salt sting turn into tears no one would ever see. Days turned into a haze of gray sky, salt spray, and the creak of oars. The sea was a restless companion, sometimes gentle as a cradle, sometimes wild as a berserker's howl. She sat near the prow, her knees drawn up, cloak wrapped tight against the morning chill. The small carved saint remained hidden in the ship's niche, but she often caught herself glancing at it, as though it might whisper secrets only she could hear. The young warrior from the raid, the one with the cut across his brow, now sat nearby, sharpening his blade with a piece of whetstone. "Why do you keep staring at the waves?" he asked, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the quiet that had settled over her. She did not turn. "Because they never stop moving," she said. "They teach us how to yield and how to fight." He looked puzzled, his young face still unlined by the deeper shadows of understanding. "I don't see wisdom in water," he admitted. "I see danger and fish." At that, she almost laughed. Almost. She finally looked at him, her eyes as cold as the northern fjords. "When you have fought enough battles, you'll learn that the sea is a teacher harsher than any swordmaster." He returned to his blade, frowning, but said no more. Around them, the longship rocked in the swell. The Jarl barked orders from the center, his voice carrying above the wind. "Steady. Watch the horizon. The sea hides more than waves." She scanned the distant line where water met sky. Already, dark shapes crept along the edge, rising and falling like the backs of sleeping dragons. Another storm. By late afternoon, the first fat drops of rain struck the deck. Sailors scrambled to secure cargo, tie down loose gear, and cover shields with oilskin. The sail was lowered. The ship now relied on oars alone. The waves grew teeth, gnashing at the hull with each crest. Water slapped across the deck, stinging eyes and soaking cloaks in minutes. She remained at the prow, fingers gripping the rail so hard her knuckles turned white. Each heave felt like the world's heartbeat slamming into her bones. A memory rose unbidden, her father's hand on her shoulder as he taught her to read the stars. "When the sea grows angry," he had said, "do not fight it head on." Turn your body as you would in a sword dance. Let its power pass around you. She whispered those words now, a silent litany drowned by the storm's roar. A sudden shriek tore through the wind. One of the oarsmen had lost his grip and pitched backward into the black water. Another warrior lunged to grab him, but caught only air and foam. Without thinking, she flung herself over the side. The cold slammed into her like a mace, stealing her breath in one violent gasp. She plunged deep, the world above turning to a kaleidoscope of shifting moonlight and froth. She kicked upward, eyes burning with salt. Fingers clawed through water until they closed around the man's tunic. His eyes were wide, mouth open in a silent plea as he thrashed. She hauled him toward the surface, every stroke a war against the sea's grip. Above, silhouettes leaned over the rail, ropes snaking down. She felt her strength wane, arms trembling. Her lungs burned, vision dimming at the edges. At the last moment, rough hands seized her wrist. She felt herself lifted, scraped across the hull like a beached seal. They spilled onto the deck, coughing and retching seawater. The young warrior knelt beside her, his hands hovering helplessly. "You're mad," he panted. "You could have died." She sat up slowly, her hair plastered to her face, breaths ragged. "I know," she rasped, a thin smile ghosting across her lips. "But the sea does not get to choose today." A ripple of laughter, nervous and brittle, spread among the men. Even the Jarl cracked a grin before barking them back to their posts. She sat there for a moment longer, feeling the warmth of life crawl painfully back into her limbs. The rescued oarsman wept beside her, gripping her arm as though afraid she might vanish again. She patted his shoulder once, then stood, ignoring the ache in her muscles. The storm raged through the night, pounding the ship until it creaked like an old tree in the wind. By dawn, the sea had softened, replaced by a pale gray calm that stretched endlessly in every direction. They set sail again, the battered warriors working in silence, each man alone with his own ghosts. In the days that followed, they raided a small coastal village. She moved among the narrow alleys, blade dripping, the familiar rhythm of combat echoing in her bones. But something had shifted. A girl no older than 10 had hidden in a pile of nets, her face smeared with ash. When the Shieldmaiden found her, the child did not cry out. She simply looked up, her eyes huge and hollow. They stared at each other for a long, hanging moment. Then the Shieldmaiden sheathed her sword, turned, and walked away. Behind her, she heard the girl's soft gasp, a sound too small to touch the raging sea or the flaming rooftops. Back at the ship, the Jarl questioned her absence from her assigned sector. She lied easily. "I was guarding the north alley." He accepted it, too eager to count loot and casualties to question further. That night, as the warriors drank themselves into oblivion, she sat alone near the prow, watching the moon rise over quiet water. She pulled the small saint carving from the niche and held it up to the moonlight. Its face, worn smooth, seemed almost kind. "What would you think of me now?" she whispered. "A ghost on 2 legs, a blade with no scabbard." The waves lapped gently at the hull, as if answering her confession with patient indifference. She tucked the carving back into its place and lay down, the planks cold and unyielding beneath her. As sleep crept in, she dreamed not of fire or steel, but of a quiet meadow, yellow flowers swaying under a summer sky. Her father's voice called to her from somewhere beyond the hills. But before she could reach him, the dream splintered, and she woke to the sound of laughter and the stench of spilled ale. The morning after the raid dawned blood orange, a sky so stark it looked like the gods had slashed it open. Smoke still curled over the village behind them, thin gray ribbons climbing to the heavens, carrying the smell of charred timber and lost prayers. She stood at the ship's edge, gaze locked on the horizon as if daring it to move. Her fingers drummed lightly against the rim of her shield. Every part of her felt bruised, not only her skin, but someplace deeper, somewhere words never dared go. The young warrior with the scar approached, eyes wary. He carried a small jug of ale, hands trembling slightly. Without asking, he offered it. She took it, sipped, then handed it back without a word. He stayed beside her, silent for a time, watching the waves slap lazily against the hull. "Why didn't you kill the girl?" he finally asked, his voice low, as if afraid to invite the god's judgment. She didn't look at him. "Because one day, the memory of mercy is worth more than all the gold in the world." He frowned, rolling her words in his mind like a stone in his palm. "We are raiders," he said. "We do not leave loose ends." "Then you have never truly seen the cost of a sword," she replied, her voice quiet as a funeral chant. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, he turned and shuffled away, his steps heavy, echoing across the deck. Later, as they loaded their loot, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, carved idols torn from shrines, the Jarl paced the ship, counting and cataloging each piece as though reciting sacred verses. "Next stop, the river town," he bellowed, voice full of the triumph of a man who mistook plunder for destiny. "We will fill our halls with silver before the moon wanes." A ragged cheer rose among the crew, but she only listened, her face unreadable. When they set sail again, the longship skimmed across the glassy sea, sails fat with a northern breeze. At night, they anchored in a hidden cove, fires flickering like tiny stars against the dark cliffs. The Shieldmaiden sat alone, legs crossed, her sword across her knees. She polished the blade with slow, reverent movements. Each stroke felt like a silent prayer, a vow renewed under the indifferent stars. Memories from home drifted into her mind, unbidden. She saw her mother's hands weaving wool, her brother carving runes into driftwood, her father's quiet eyes the day he handed her the first shield. The Jarl joined her then, sinking down with a groan, his joints crackling under his weight. He smelled of mead and seaweed. "You fight like Thor's own thunder," he said, eyes squinting in the firelight. "Yet your eyes are always elsewhere." She continued polishing, not meeting his gaze. "You question your place?" He pressed, leaning closer. She paused. "I do not question my place," she said slowly. "I question what is left when the fighting ends." The Jarl laughed, loud and harsh. "There is no end. The sword is the end. That is the only truth the Norns have ever spun for us." Her fingers tightened around the blade's hilt. She felt the old ache in her ribs where an axe had once bitten deep, a scar that still sang to her on cold mornings. "You believe in the god's weaving," she said, her voice as even as a sharpened edge. "I believe in the thread I choose to pull." The Jarl regarded her with something between amusement and unease, then stood abruptly. "Careful, Shieldmaiden," he warned. "Threads can strangle as easily as they guide." When he left, she finally looked up at the stars, her lips parting in a silent question only the night could hear. The next day, the river town appeared on the horizon, its wooden palisades rising like brittle ribs against the forest. Smoke curled from chimneys. Fishermen dotted the shallows in reed boats. The Jarl gave the order. Shields locked, oars drawn in tight, they slipped up the river like a snake. Dogs barked, horns blared, but too late. Warriors leaped ashore, axes swinging, shields slamming into panicked defenders. She moved among them, her sword a silent ghost. Each thrust, each parry, each kill, an echo of the same rhythm that pulsed in her veins. But amid the chaos, she saw something that stopped her breath. A woman stood at a doorway, shielding two small children behind her, a spear clutched awkwardly in shaking hands. Her face was pale, eyes wild with a mother's terror. For a heartbeat, the Shieldmaiden saw her own reflection in that woman's defiant posture, a single human spine against an entire storm. Their eyes met. No words passed, but 1,000 stories swam between them in that instant. She stepped forward. The woman's hands trembled so violently, the spear wobbled. The Shieldmaiden raised her sword, then, with a swift motion, knocked the spear aside and turned, shoving the woman back into the hut. "Hide," she hissed. "Do not come out until you hear silence." The woman nodded, her eyes two moons, then disappeared into the dark. Behind her, she heard the roar of her comrades, the clash of steel, the brittle snap of bones. She turned back into the fray, blade flashing. Hours later, the river town burned, its treasures stacked on the shore like offerings to some greedy god. The Jarl stood atop a barrel, declaring their victory, his voice cracking with drunken triumph. She watched, silent and distant, her mind still replaying the mother's wide eyes. When they returned to the ship, the Jarl praised each warrior, slapping backs, handing out extra shares of mead. When he reached her, he grinned. "You saved many today, Shieldmaiden. The gods must favor you." She did not answer. She simply looked past him, to the river's dark mouth, and the forest beyond, as though searching for something she had lost before she was even born. That night, as the fires burned low and laughter drifted into uneasy dreams, she sat at the ship's edge again. Her sword lay across her lap, but tonight she did not clean it. Instead, she traced each notch and scar on the blade, her fingers soft and lingering. She imagined each mark as a doorway, a possible life she had not lived. Weaver, farmer, healer, mother. She felt the weight of her choice settle over her like a cloak soaked in rain. Above, the stars turned slowly, indifferent witnesses to her private reckoning. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called, a lonely, echoing sound that felt like a question and an answer all at once. She did not sleep. At dawn, the others stirred around her, rubbing sleep from swollen eyes, reaching for stale bread and cheap ale. She stood, sliding her sword into its scabbard, lifting her shield to her shoulder. Today, they would sail again, to another coast, another town, another ledger of souls to weigh. She did not know how many more dawns awaited her on this path. But as the sail unfurled and the wind caught their ship, she lifted her gaze, the ghost of a promise in her eyes. A promise to the woman she might have been, and to the woman she still might become, somewhere beyond the blade, beyond the burn of salt and the roar of blood. When the Shieldmaiden finally returned home after a long summer of raids, the fjord lay still as a mirror, reflecting the first pale light of autumn. The ship slipped through the morning fog, its hull heavy with spoils and secrets. Ravens wheeled above, calling out as though welcoming them back, or perhaps warning them of debts still unpaid. She stepped off the plank last, boots landing in the wet sand with a low thud. The others laughed and staggered ahead, hauling chests of silver, barrels of grain, and fine cloth stolen from distant shores. Children ran to meet their fathers. Mothers wailed relief or scanned for missing faces. Dogs barked, goats bleated, and somewhere a single flute played a thin, wavering note. She felt each sound like an echo deep in her ribs, as if her body were a hollow drum. The smell of smoke and wet grass wrapped around her, almost strangling in its familiarity. Her mother approached slowly, face carved by years and wind, gray hair pulled back in a single braid. They stood in silence for a long moment. No tears, no words, only the language of eyes that had seen too much. The old woman touched the edge of her daughter's shield, tracing a fresh dent near the rim. "Another story," she said simply. The Shieldmaiden nodded, exhaling slowly. She laid the shield against the wall of the longhouse and unstrapped her sword, feeling her shoulders drop as though she had set down an entire mountain. Inside, the hearth was still cold. Her mother knelt to blow life into the coals, coaxing a shy flame to bloom beneath the old iron pot. The smell of peat smoke and dried herbs rose gently, curling around the room like a forgotten lullaby. She sank onto a low bench, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. Familiar, comforting, real in a way that steel never was. Her fingertips traced runes carved into the edge, each mark a prayer or a curse, whispered by ancestors long gone. Children peeked through the doorway, eyes wide at the warrior returned from distant storms. One small girl, no older than 7, tiptoed closer and touched the fringe of her cloak. "Are you a Valkyrie?" the girl asked, voice a thread of awe and fear. The Shieldmaiden looked down, saw her reflection in those wide eyes, all the blood, all the ghosts, all the scars hidden beneath the wool and fur. "No," she said softly, "not yet." At night, the village feasted in her honor, as was custom. Tables groaned beneath roasted fish, sour goat cheese, wild berries, and flatbread. The Jarl raised a horn of mead, roaring blessings to Odin and Freya, boasting of her victories. But she sat at the edge of the firelight, a ghost among the living. The voices blurred into a single endless chant, drums and laughter fading into the hollow of her bones. Old women sang songs of warriors riding into Valhalla. Young men bragged of scars and near deaths. Children ran with sticky hands, reenacting raids with sticks and shrieks. She watched the flames flicker, each spark a memory, a mother's scream, a man's final gasp, the cold press of her own blade against a trembling throat. When a young skald offered her a verse, bright, triumphant, she stood and left without a word, the hush of the crowd closing behind her like a wave. Outside, the night was sharp and bright, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. She walked to the edge of the fjord, sat on a cold rock, and removed her boots. The water licked at her toes, black and patient. She remembered how it felt to stand on the deck, salt wind in her hair, each breath a promise of conquest. But here, the sea felt different, less like a battlefield and more like a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. A shadow moved beside her. It was the young warrior with the scar, his breath visible in the crisp air. He sat without asking, arms resting on his knees. "They sing of you as if you are already a saga," he said after a long pause. She did not look at him. "Songs are for the dead," she murmured. He laughed softly, not mocking. "And yet, you are the one still here." Silence stretched between them, deep and awkward, like a wound that refused to close. After a time, he pulled a small carved figure from his pocket, a tiny bear, rough but tenderly made. "For you," he said, holding it out. "For protection, perhaps?" She hesitated before taking it, turning it over in her palm. Its surface was worn from his skin, and somewhere in its crude lines, she felt an unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said, her voice a whisper almost stolen by the wind. He nodded and stood, leaving her alone again. She pressed the bear to her forehead, closing her eyes. In that moment, she did not see the fields of the dead or the walls of distant towns. Instead, she saw a warm hearth, a child's laughter, a life without the taste of iron and ash. But when she opened her eyes, the cold sea still waited at her feet, the village still roared behind her, and the sword still waited beside her door. At dawn, she returned to the longhouse. Her mother was awake, stirring the pot, humming a low tune that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Without a word, the Shieldmaiden knelt and began mending a torn cloak. Needle in hand, she felt a different kind of power, patient, deliberate, quiet as the morning mist. For a few hours, she was not the blade, not the storm. She was only hands and wool, stitch and breath. When the Jarl sent for her later that day, a new raid to plan another town to burn, she looked at her mother's bent, back at the children chasing each other in the yard, at the carved bear on the table. She stood slowly, gathering her cloak, the weight of choice settling over her shoulders like a second skin. She was a Shieldmaiden. That much was true. But perhaps, beneath the steel and stories, she was something more, something still waiting to be found beyond the roar of the waves and the clang of axes. That winter, the fjord froze in thick, silvery plates, transforming the restless water into a silent field of glass. At night, when the moon rose low and wide, the ice glowed like a ghostly pathway stretching into the dark unknown. Children played on its edges, laughing as they slid and fell, their voices carrying into the forest like echoes from another world. Inside the longhouse, the Shieldmaiden sat by the hearth, hands busy with wool, mind wandering to distant shores. Around her, women wove stories as they spun flax and mended tunics, voices weaving a different tapestry than the sagas sung by skalds. These were stories of lost husbands, failed harvests, children born under moonlight, and quiet grief hidden beneath strong backs. One woman, Astrid, whose laughter was sharp as a gull's cry, recounted how she once chased a goat all morning because it had eaten the last of her winter onions. Another described her first childbirth alone in the forest, guided only by the sound of her own breath and the rhythm of the earth. The Shieldmaiden listened, stitching silently. In each story, she heard a different kind of courage, one not carved into rune stones or roared over mead, but stitched into every breath and footstep. She found herself studying her mother's hands, cracked, strong, fingers bent from years of gripping paddles, baskets, and knives. The same hands that had lifted her as a baby, smacked her when she was reckless, and later tied the first braids into her battle hair. "Your mind drifts far tonight," her mother said suddenly, not looking up. "It drifts where the sea cannot reach," she replied, voice low. Her mother hummed in reply, as though she understood. Perhaps she did. After all, every woman in the longhouse had once stood on her own threshold of choice, stay by the hearth or follow the storm. Outside, a boy's cry pierced the air. She rose instinctively, stepping into the icy night. Near the barn, she found a small figure curled on the ground, sobbing. His foot had slipped between two stones, twisting his ankle badly. She knelt, brushing hair from his tear-streaked face. "You are brave," she whispered, lifting him easily into her arms. The boy clung to her neck, his heartbeat frantic against her collarbone. As she carried him back, she felt a different strength stirring inside, not the surge before a raid, not the cold certainty of a killing blow, but something softer, deeper. When she laid him beside the hearth, his mother rushed forward, eyes wide with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she choked out, gathering the boy close. The Shieldmaiden nodded and sat back on her bench, feeling warmth radiate up her spine. She looked into the fire and saw not the burning halls of enemy towns, but the gentle glow of a home kept alive by small daily mercies. That night, she slept curled near the hearth, her cloak spread like a soft cocoon. Dreams came in waves, flashes of white sails, the smell of seaweed, the creak of oars. But they mixed now with other images. Her mother's smile as she handed her a warm bowl of soup, the boy's small hands clutching her neck, the weight of wool in her lap. At dawn, she woke to the sound of snow sliding from the roof. She stepped outside to find the world washed in pale gold, each branch outlined in fragile frost. She inhaled deeply, letting the cold sting her lungs, as if reminding her she was alive, still here, still capable of more than one kind of fight. As she walked to the edge of the frozen fjord, she saw tracks, fox, deer, raven. She knelt to touch them, fingertips cold and tender. Each track was a silent message, a hint of other lives unfolding parallel to her own. She sat there for a long time, legs tucked beneath her, listening to the world breathe. Later that day, she joined the women at the dye pots. Berries, bark, and lichen simmered into deep reds, soft yellows, and muddy browns. The Shieldmaiden had never learned this craft. On raids, she had only known the red of blood, the black of burned walls. But here, the colors spoke a different language, one of patience, of waiting, of slow alchemy. Astrid handed her a bundle of wool and showed her how to stir, how to listen for the pot's gentle bubble. "It's like tending a wound," Astrid said, grinning. "Slow, careful, or it turns sour." She smiled faintly, dipping her fingers into the warm water, feeling the dye seep into the strands. With each turn, she felt tension unwind from her shoulders, a slow uncoiling of all the years she had braced herself for the next strike. That night, she held the dyed wool close to her face, inhaling the earthy scent. It smelled of moss, wood smoke, and something else, something like forgiveness. As she lay on her pallet, her mother sat beside her, carding more wool. In the flicker of lamplight, the old woman looked softer, almost young. "You were born under a red moon," her mother said suddenly, voice thin as thread. "I thought you would be a storm, and I was right. But storms also water the earth, you know." She turned her head to look at her mother, eyes stinging. "Am I more than the storm now?" she asked, the question trembling on her lips. Her mother set down the wool, reached over and brushed hair from her forehead. "You always were," she whispered. Sleep came slowly, but when it arrived, it was deep and dreamless. She woke in the gray dawn to the sound of ravens, her hands still curled around the bear, carving from the young warrior. That morning, she did not reach for her sword. Instead, she helped split firewood, fed the goats, and mended torn cloaks by the door. The movements felt foreign at first, but by midday, they became a rhythm, one she realized she had longed for without knowing. At supper, the young warrior sat beside her, silent but present. Their shoulders touched lightly, a quiet acknowledgement that words were not always needed. She looked around the hall, at the faces aglow in firelight, scarred, weathered, soft, strong, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. She understood then that while the battlefield demanded one kind of bravery, staying, building, tending, that required another. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to wield that kind of strength too. As the days lengthened and the cold began to recede, life inside the longhouse shifted like a thawing river. The Shieldmaiden rose each morning to new sounds, the creak of melting ice, the chatter of returning birds, the murmur of streams reawakening under thin sheets of frost. She found herself drawn more often to the small herb garden by the side of the house. There, her mother tended to tender green shoots, whispering to them as though they were kin. It was not the roar of the sea or the clash of shields she had known, but a quiet conversation between fingers and soil. "Plants listen," her mother said one afternoon, pressing a seed into the dark earth. "They hear your worries, your hopes. They don't judge." The Shieldmaiden knelt beside her, hands awkward in the dirt. She tried to mimic the motions, loosen the soil, cradle the seed, cover it gently. With each movement, she felt herself sink deeper into the rhythm of the land, a beat as old and unyielding as any battle drum. Nearby, Astrid and the other women prepared wool for weaving. The air was alive with the scent of lanolin and dye pots, the click of spindle and loom like a gentle heartbeat. Occasionally, one would burst into song, a simple, repetitive melody that seemed to wrap around them like a soft cloak. In the evenings, after supper, she sat with the young warrior by the hearth. They spoke of small things, the stubborn goat that kept escaping the pen, the way the frost shaped intricate patterns on the roof beams, the dreams of warmer days ahead. One night, as she carved runes into a strip of wood, the young warrior hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever miss the raids?" She paused, her knife hovering above the wood. The firelight caught in her hair, outlining the fine scars along her jaw, each one a story, each one a ghost. "I miss the salt in the wind," she admitted after a moment. "The silence before a fight, the way the sea roared like a living creature under the prow. But I do not miss the ending, the burning halls, the screams. He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. I used to dream of being a great warrior, leading ships beyond the edge of the world. But now, I think I would rather build something that lasts. She studied him, seeing not the boy eager for glory, but the man emerging, steady and uncertain all at once. Without thinking, she reached over and traced a small cut on his cheek, a mark from sparring weeks before. "You already are a warrior," she said softly. "It is not always the sword that proves it." He looked up, eyes shining, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Days passed in this new quiet rhythm. The Shieldmaiden began to learn the ways of weaving, counting warp threads, keeping tension steady, choosing patterns that echoed mountains and rivers. It was a battle of patience, and she lost often. Knots snarled, fingers cramped, colors bled where they shouldn't. But with each mistake, she felt her own edges soften. In the clumsy, awkward motions, she discovered a different kind of strength, the courage to create rather than destroy, to persist in silence rather than shout into the storm. One morning, she joined a group walking into the forest to gather birch bark and early herbs. The air smelled of wet moss and pine, the ground spongy underfoot. As they moved, they spoke in hushed tones about the coming summer, the calves soon to be born, the next feast day. She carried a basket on her hip, feeling its weight shift with each step. When they reached a clearing, Astrid pointed to a patch of bright green, wild garlic. Strong, stubborn, and sharp, like you. They laughed, a sound that scattered crows from the treetops. On the way back, they paused by a frozen stream, breaking off thin sheets of ice to sip the cold, sweet water beneath. She watched her reflection ripple, saw the warrior she had been, and the woman she was becoming merge in the trembling surface. That night, an unexpected guest arrived at the longhouse, an old skald, traveling from village to village, carrying stories like embers in his mind. The people gathered quickly, benches dragged forward, bowls of ale passed around. The skald began his tale, a saga of a young Shieldmaiden who had set sail alone, seeking the sun at the world's edge. His words were like smoke, twisting and curling in the air, pulling them all into his web. As he spoke, she felt herself disappear into the story. The salt spray on her face, the creak of the mast, the wild heartbeat of freedom. But then came the ending she had not expected. The Shieldmaiden, weary from storms and solitude, returned home, laid her sword at her mother's feet, and planted seeds in the earth instead of steel in her enemies. A hush fell. For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then, the old skald's eyes met hers, a knowing glimmer in their depths. She rose quietly and stepped outside, the cold air a sharp blessing on her skin. Above her, stars sprawled across the sky like scattered runes, ancient and patient. She tilted her head back, letting a tear slide down her cheek. It tasted of salt, of the sea she had once called her only home. But here, under the vast night, she felt the shape of a new home growing in her chest. A hearth, a loom, hands reaching for hers in the dark. She stood there until the skald's voice faded into silence, until the last ember of the story winked out inside the hall. And when she returned to the fire, she found the young warrior waiting, a bowl of warm broth in his hands. He pressed it into hers without a word, their fingers brushing in a brief, electric whisper. She drank slowly, each mouthful an anchor to this moment, to this life she had not known she needed. Tomorrow, she would return to the loom. She would mend tunics, shape dye, and walk the forest for new herbs. And maybe, just maybe, she would teach the young warrior to weave, to carve, to find strength not just in his arms, but in his patience. For now, she sat by the hearth, bowl empty, heart full. The sea would always call, always echo in her bones. But here, in this quiet hall of warmth and laughter and fragile new hopes, she realized The fiercest battle was not always fought with steel, but with the courage to stay. The first true spring storm arrived under a crescent moon. Wind howled around the longhouse like a hungry wolf, rattling the wooden shutters and tugging at the roof thatch as if trying to peel it away. The Shieldmaiden woke in the darkness, heart pounding, hands instinctively searching for a sword that was no longer by her side. She sat up, listening to the storm's breath swirl above the hearth. Rain battered the roof in wild bursts, as though Thor himself was drumming with his hammer on the heavens. She stood, pulling her cloak tight, and stepped outside. The cold rain slapped her cheeks, each drop a sharp kiss that felt strangely cleansing. She walked around the house, checking for loosened planks, retrieving a stray bucket blown into the mud. In that moment, she felt more alive than she ever had on a blood-soaked battlefield. Inside, she found her mother coaxing the fire, whispering to it like an old friend. The young warrior appeared beside her, hair damp, eyes wide. Without a word, he began to help, stacking extra wood, sealing cracks with wool scraps. They worked side by side in silence, a dance more intimate than any they had shared on the training fields. When dawn finally broke, the storm retreated like a sulking giant. Outside, the ground glistened with new puddles, each reflecting fragments of sky. Birds returned hesitantly, their tentative songs stitching the morning together. The Shieldmaiden stepped into the yard and breathed in deeply. The air was sharp, full of pine and wet earth. A line of tracks crisscrossed the mud, foxes, cats, perhaps even a bear. Life had crept closer while the storm had raged. Later that day, she joined Astrid and the women at the weaving shed. Sunlight spilled through narrow slits in the walls, casting patterns like rippling waves. Astrid showed her a new design, a spiral of interlocking knots, meant to symbolize the turning of seasons, the endless dance of birth, death, and rebirth. "It's called the word knot," Astrid explained, fingers guiding the thread. A reminder that even warriors are woven into the web of life. She nodded, eyes fixed on the loom. Her fingers hesitated at first, trembling like a young sapling in the wind. But gradually, they found a rhythm. Under her hands, the wool transformed from formless strands into a sturdy, beautiful fabric. With each pass of the shuttle, she felt old echoes drain away, the war cries, the clash of iron on bone, the last gasps of fallen foes. In their place rose new sounds, the hush of wool sliding across wood, the heartbeat of the loom, her own breath anchoring her to the moment. During breaks, she and the young warrior began practicing carving together. He taught her to shape small animals from driftwood, bears, ravens, otters. She watched him lean forward, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, and felt something warm unfurl inside her. One evening, after supper, they walked down to the fjord. The ice had finally melted, and the black water lapped gently at the shore. "Do you remember your first raid?" he asked suddenly, skipping a smooth stone across the water. She hesitated, then nodded. "I was 15. We landed under moonlight. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would shatter my ribs. When I killed my first man, I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollow, but I lied to myself, told myself it was glory." He listened, eyes on the dark water. "I wanted that once," he murmured. "To be remembered in song, to die with an axe in hand. But now, I think I'd rather live to see the spring fields bloom, to carve toys for children I might have one day." She turned to him, reaching for his hand. Their fingers intertwined, rough and calloused, strong yet tender. "Life beyond the sword is its own kind of saga," she whispered. They stood together in silence, the fjord breathing around them, moonlight painting their shadows in long silver ribbons. As summer approached, she found herself more and more drawn into the heartbeat of the village. She learned to tan hides properly, to mend nets for the fishermen, to prepare birch bark containers for storing herbs and seeds. Each day she felt the memory of her blade soften a little more, like a sharp stone weathered by rain and time. One morning, a neighbor arrived with news. A nearby settlement had been attacked by raiders from the south. Old habits surged in her blood, and her hand twitched for a weapon. But instead of reaching for steel, she reached for her healing herbs, for bandages and salves. Together with the other women, she ran to aid the survivors, tending burns, stitching wounds, sitting beside the dying as they whispered final words. When she returned home that night, her hands were stained with blood, but not from taking life. This time, she had fought to save it. By the hearth, her mother met her gaze and simply nodded, no words needed. A young warrior rose and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his touch a silent vow. She fell into sleep that night as though sinking into a safe harbor, carried by the gentle waves of her own breath. In her dreams, she saw a vast tapestry stretching across the night sky. Threads of silver and red wove through it, some bright and strong, others frayed and thin. At the center, a knot pulsed like a star, binding all paths together. She woke at dawn and stepped outside, feeling dew on her bare feet, the earth cool and forgiving beneath her. She watched as the first sunbeams slid over the fjord, catching on each ripple like a blade of light. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the echo of that star-shaped knot within. She understood then. Her saga was not only about iron and fire, but about soil and song, healing and holding, staying when the easy choice was to run. As the seasons turned once more, the Shieldmaiden found herself standing at the edge of the fjord, eyes fixed on the horizon. Ships moved in and out, like drifting memories. Some carried young warriors eager for glory. Others returned with sails torn and souls haunted. She often sat near the water's edge, weaving small figures from rushes and reeds. Little horses, tiny ships, protective knots. Children gathered around her, giggling as she taught them how to shape the simple toys. At first, they watched her with wide eyes, stories of her old battles echoing in hushed whispers. She once fought 5 men alone. She sailed with kings. Her blade drank more blood than the fjord itself. But as they played beside her, they saw someone different, someone gentle, patient, endlessly curious. The young warrior, now her steadfast companion, began building a new longhouse just beyond the village edge. He carved runic blessings into the beams, each one a small prayer to keep sickness and sorrow at bay. Together, they planned a space with wide windows to let in the northern light, a hearth big enough to warm many hearts, and a garden for herbs and roots. One dawn, she joined him on the roof frame, the sunrise behind her turning her hair to threads of flame. They worked without speaking, each hammer strike echoing like a heartbeat, a rhythm of quiet belonging. As they finished, she looked across the valley. Sheep grazed on soft green slopes, women carried baskets of seaweed to dry, fishermen mended nets by the shore. Ravens cawed from the treetops, as though narrating the entire tapestry of life below. She realized then that every day was a kind of battle, not against enemies from distant shores, but against doubt, despair, and the urge to vanish into old ghosts. When the first heavy snows arrived, she gathered the children into her hall to share stories by firelight. Her voice was low and melodic, weaving images into the air. Fierce goddesses, sea serpents, cunning fox spirits. She did not boast of raids or gory duels. Instead, she spoke of the hidden sagas, the silent courage of those who stayed behind, the quiet power of mothers who held villages together, the patient faith of healers who stitched torn flesh and spirits alike. After each story, the children sat stunned for a moment and burst into eager chatter. She watched them and felt a warmth grow in her chest. This, she realized, was how her spirit would sail into future generations. Not on blood-soaked shields or in roaring sagas, but through laughter, wonder, and tender inheritance. By the second spring, small green shoots sprouted in her herb garden. She taught young women how to mix salves for burns, how to grind dried moss into healing pastes. They called her Vidder Mohir the Spirit Mother. Sometimes, late at night, she felt a sudden ache for the rush of battle, the roar of comrades, the crack of shields, the sharp breath before a charge. But when she opened her eyes, she saw her new world, a hearth still glowing, the young warrior breathing softly beside her, the scent of dried lavender hanging in the rafters. She rose in those moments, moving quietly through the moonlit house. She touched the loom, the carved animal toys, the row of herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beams. Every item whispered a piece of her new saga. Outside, the stars shivered above the fjord. She would sometimes walk to the shore and whisper her old battle cries into the waves, letting them drift far into the darkness. She imagined them reaching distant shores, echoing into the ears of young warriors across the sea. On one such night, as she stood ankle-deep in the water, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found the young warrior holding a cloak. He wrapped it around her shoulders, his forehead pressing gently against hers. "You are more than your sword," he murmured. "You have become the shield for all of us now." She felt tears she hadn't realized she carried begin to fall, hot against the cold sea air. Years passed. Her hair turned silver, and fine lines mapped the story of her face. Yet in her eyes, there still burned the flicker of that first battle spark. When her time finally drew near, she lay in her longhouse, the hearth burning low, the scent of pine and smoked herbs wrapping around her like a cloak. The young warrior, older now but still strong, held her hand. Children and grandchildren, some hers, some simply claimed by her heart, sat around, silent and watchful. She took a slow, deep breath. In her mind, she saw all her paths at once. The roaring raids under stormy skies, the bitter taste of salted blood, the silent triumphs of tending wounds, the warmth of small hands learning to weave. A final vision shimmered before her, a great tapestry, woven not of wool, but of moments each thread a choice, a word, a breath. At its center, a gleaming knot pulsed, echoing the old word knot Astrid once showed her, binding all things in endless return. With one last exhale, she smiled. It was not the smile of a conqueror nor a martyr, but of a woman who had truly lived, as warrior, as healer, as teacher, as lover. Outside, the first spring buds opened, and a raven called from the pine ridge. In the fjord, ripples moved softly, as if carrying her spirit onward, beyond the known seas. They would sing of her in hushed tones by firelight, not as the fiercest shieldmaiden who cleaved skulls under foreign moons, but as the quiet storm who taught them to fight for life itself, to carve new sagas in tender spaces. Because in the end, she had discovered the truest victory, not to die in battle with blade raised high, but to live each day as a deliberate act of creation, each breath as a gift. And so her story carried on echoing in looms, in herb gardens, in the soft steps of children who would one day become warriors in their own way. When the fires have long burned down and the last echoes of sword clashes have drifted into the night, there remains a hush of stillness where stories choose to rest before finding new hearts to awaken. In that hush, if you listen closely, you might hear the soft breath of a shield maiden who once defied every boundary, every expectation. She began as a girl with curious eyes, weaving furs in the corner of a smoky hall. They saw her small hands, delicate wrists, and imagined her future limited to cradle songs and hearth chores. But she heard something else, a call from deep within the fjords, in the wind that rattled the shields at night, in the lonely cry of the raven sweeping across the ice-laced waves. That call was not just to fight, but to become to taste the raw salt of the sea, to smell the iron in fresh blood, to feel the crack of bone beneath her shield. Yet, Behind every clash and every storm, there hid another truth. Even warriors, even the fiercest among them, carry a secret longing for warmth. In the end, hers was not a life defined solely by victories or conquests. Her true saga wove through the tender moments, the hush of a small child resting against her knee, the way morning frost traced delicate lacework on the longhouse beams, the laughter that spilled like mead on festival nights. Perhaps what makes her story so alive, so haunting, is not the magnitude of her kills or the wealth of her raids, but her transformation. From blade-bearer to hearthkeeper, from thunder to gentle rain. When we imagine the Viking world, we often conjure images of horned helmets, burning villages, and feasts so wild they shook the moon. But inside those grand epics lies a quiet undercurrent, an unspoken pact between life and death, between destiny and choice. She walked that thin line with bare feet, leaving traces only the patient can see. Each morning she chose to rise, strap on her leather bindings, greet the sting of icy air. Each night she chose to set down her weapons, listen to the hush of the sleeping hall, and remind herself she was more than steel and scars. In her final breath, she left us a gift, a way of seeing life, not as a series of victories or failures, but as a tapestry of moments, some bright as sun on the fjord, some dark as moonless seas. Each thread holds weight, each knot tells a story. She taught us that true strength is not only the ability to cleave shields or stand unbent beneath foreign banners. True strength is learning to surrender to tenderness, to open your palms even when they still smell of war, to become a protector not just of land and kin, but of laughter, of tears, of quiet dawns. When we think of her now, let us not only see the red-smeared axe, the storm-slicked deck, the howl of wolves at her side. Let us also see the small clay bowl of herbs she ground at dawn, the way her fingers twisted flax into thread, the careful arrangement of shells and pebbles left as tokens on the beach. These small things echo longer than war cries. These small acts become the true saga whispered across generations. Outside, the fjord remains endless, patient, reflecting the sky's shifting moods. Perhaps tonight, a young girl stands at its edge, her breath curling in the cold, eyes alive with questions her mother cannot answer. Perhaps she will hear the same silent call, feel the same stirring beneath her ribs. She may never pick up a shield or set foot on a longship. Or she might. But whatever path she carves, she will carry a fragment of that Shieldmaiden's spirit, the courage to claim her own shape, to sail her own currents, to write her own runes in frost and fire. That is the echo that matters. The echo that survives plagues, burning halls, and the slow erosion of time. So tonight, when you lay your head down and the walls of your room blur into dream, imagine the creak of a longship beneath starlight, the hush of 1,000 breaths waiting for the sun. Imagine her standing at the prow, hair whipping like dark silk, eyes fixed beyond the known sea. Imagine her smile, not of triumph, but of knowing, of becoming. In that image, you might find your own wildness reflected, your own quiet call. Sleep well, fellow traveler. And remember, each of us, in our own silent battles, carries the spirit of the Shieldmaiden somewhere deep within.